Welcome to McClatchy's Beyond the Bubble podcast on this exciting Thursday here in the nation's capital where, believe it or not, we are now little more than 2 weeks away from the Iowa caucuses. Coming up, we're going to debate the political consequences of the Warren-Sanders on-again, off-again feud, discuss why one particularly fickle group of voters might decide who wins in Iowa, and ponder the puzzling campaign of now former candidate Cory Booker. Join us every week where we will take you inside the race for the White House in a way only McClatchy's 30 newsrooms can, by talking about how the election is playing out in the states that will matter. I'm Alex Roarty, a national political correspondent for McClatchy, and today I am joined by Emily Cadei, McClatchy's political correspondent, who I learned this week shares my fondness for early aughts Italian soccer players.
True. Good to be here.
If you know who Gattuso is, you are in good company on this podcast. And this week, we are especially pleased to welcome back to the program Adam Wollner, McClatchy's politics editor. Adam, so great for you to come back to the show.
It's great to be back. I don't really have anything to add about Italian soccer in any era, or soccer really at all. I just hope that Emily and I can remain civil. Our football teams are matching up on Sunday, the 49ers and the Packers in the NFC Championship game. So hopefully, unlike Sanders and Warren, we're going to keep our personal disputes outside the confines of this podcast studio. You're right. Away from the hot mics, exactly.
That's right. Well, Jeremy has some backup mics for us too. Just be cautious. Okay. Well, speaking of that, we are now 2 days removed from the 7th Democratic debate, the last public showdown of the primary before Democrats in Iowa make their picks on February 3rd. And without question, the moment from Tuesday that seems to have the longest lasting consequence was the sort of confrontation, between Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Okay, the quick recap, in case you missed it, CNN reported, and Warren later alleged on the record, that Bernie Sanders told her during a 2018 meeting that he didn't think a woman could defeat Donald Trump. Explosive allegation, of course. Sanders vehemently denies saying any such thing, and during the debate, both candidates stuck to their stories and seemed intent on trying to move on, though an awkward non-handshake after the debate and the subsequent anger expressed online by admirers of both throw into question of whether that is really possible. People are calling it handshake Ghazi. I don't know if you guys
are they?
You guys know.
I did not see that.
Maybe it's just me. But here's my question for you, Emily, because other than the extreme awkwardness of the most memorable moment of the exchange, came when Warren forcefully argued why she, and any woman really, can win presidential elections. In spite of everything that's happened and the subsequent fallout, did the senator from Massachusetts come out of this debate with momentum?
I think that was a powerful moment for her. It was the headline from a lot of stories from the debate night, was Warren taking on this gender stereotype. It's something that's been talked about, that people have alluded to in a lot of different ways and in reporting and in town halls, et cetera. I mean, she gets that question a lot, I think, because Democrats are so fixated on beating Donald Trump, and then the question becomes, can a woman beat Donald Trump? It is sort of a central question after Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 when she was the heavy favorite.
So, I mean, how many stories have we seen, Emily, where there's some Democratic voter who says something along the lines of, I like Warren, but I just don't know if we're ready to vote for or elect a woman president, or if the voters Democrats need are ready to vote for.
Right.
It feels like the central, I was actually just having coffee with someone, a Democratic operative today. We kind of agree that it seems like the central question of this campaign so far.
And she took that head on, and I thought she did it in a really effective way in terms of pointing out the women on the stage had won their elections consistently and even beaten Republican incumbents, although I will say in her case, she beat Scott Brown in very deep blue Massachusetts. So it's a little bit different than, say, like an Amy Klobuchar in the Midwest or plenty of other folks in different parts of the country. Nonetheless, I thought it was effective, and I thought it was actually a really masterful way to sort of diffuse the tension, at least on the stage. They went back at it afterwards now, we know. But at the time, she really turned it and made it more about an argument about her rather than a spat between her and Bernie.
I mean, my own theory about why she has dipped in the polls, and to put it in context, from about October to now in the Real Clear Politics average, she's lost about 10 points nationally, give or take. And there were, at the time, it was a lot of questions, as we've discussed in the show, about her support for Medicare for all, whether she could pay for it, getting bogged down in some of the details, her ultimately backing off some of that support. But I always felt like that was a stand-in for questions about her electability, that, there was this recognition that, she's supporting this really big, expensive plan, and we're not sure, there's just a thought, again, Democratic voters playing pundits. I don't know if that's going to pass muster in a general election. But she hasn't really, until Tuesday, hadn't really addressed that head on, or really made an electability case for it. To me, it was the biggest moment of the debate. I know the subsequent post-debate handshake has gotten any attention, but and she did it in such a way. It was a really forceful argument about why she can be elected, and in theory, could rally a lot of women Democratic voters to her cause. Absolutely.
And I mean, one thing we do know about this race, we don't know a whole lot about how this is going to shake out, but we do know a lot of people are still making up their minds. I mean, yes. It's early for most voters. It's not so early for Iowa voters, and Iowa voters are still largely undecided. I mean, Bernie Sanders, I think one of the reasons we have seen him rise to the top of some polls is that he has such a devoted base. But there's questions about whether he can expand that base, and there's this whole other segment, like between 40 and 50% of the electorate in some of these states that are still not completely sold on their first choice. And so if someone like Warren can kind of convince them, maybe they were wavering, I don't know if she can really do it. I really like her, but I really, really, really want to beat Trump. Maybe that helped kind of shore up some confidence in her. We'll see. I mean, it's just... For me, it seemed like it was one of her most effective debates in terms of really countering some of the narratives that have emerged about her.
I agree. And so, Adam, I know you have a little different theory about who this really benefits, and we're going to get to that real quick, though, because I don't want to lose the thread on this. We have this strange situation where, again, as I alluded to at the top, Bernie and Elizabeth seem like they want to try to de-escalate this fight, right? And their campaigns have taken pains to do that. Jane Sanders, the senator's wife, not exactly a regular quote out on the campaign trail, was quoted in an Associated Press story, basically saying, urging everyone to try to move on. But is that going to be possible? Because it doesn't seem like the supporters are all that interested.
No. Well, yeah, and I'll quote a tweet from our esteemed colleague Dave Katniss, who's actually on his way to Iowa as we speak. It seems like Warren herself, I think wants to keep part of this discussion alive, particularly the role that sexism has potentially played in this campaign, just the role of women in politics in general. Even if her supporters maybe seem to be a little more uncomfortable with how this whole Sanders-Warren dispute will work in the long run, and then Bernie Sanders himself, I think, doesn't want to add a lot more fuel to the fire here, but clearly his supporters do. Sanders' supporters, as we've discussed a lot on this podcast, are very committed, have been with him since the beginning, and are very active online. I think if any of our listeners are on Twitter at all, they may have noticed a lot of Sanders supporters are tweeting snakes at Elizabeth Warren, which is really remarkable. Is given that Sanders and Warren ideologically are so close, particularly compared to other candidates in the race, and have, by all accounts, have had a good relationship, with each other, serving in the Senate together. I think we are kind of officially now into the second phase of this story, where at this point, I don't think we're going to learn much more about this private meeting between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I think they've both said what they're going to say about it on the, they've put out statements about it. They've talked about it on the debate stage. They had their little their little scuffle after the debate.
Handshake Gaza, yes.
Yes, and CNN now has released the audio from that. So I think that's kind of all we're going to get out of that, and we don't know exactly what was said in that meeting. I don't know if we're ever going to get to the bottom of that. Maybe that'll come out in some of the postmortems of the campaigns or some of the books that are written about this campaign. But I think now that the discussion has moved into the kind of this undercurrent that has been there really since the beginning of this race. And Alex, I know you even wrote a story about this. I want to say back in spring of 2019 when Beto O'Rourke had just gotten into the race and was receiving a lot of positive media attention. Pete Buttigieg that boomlet was just starting. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders were leading the polls then, and I think a lot of people were looking at this field that was very diverse, both from a racial standpoint and from a gender standpoint. But you had four white guys who were really dominating the discussion, and already a lot of Democratic women were starting to raise concerns that, even though you had the likes of Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Kristen Gillibrand at the time, just weren't able to gain a lot of traction. Now, fast forward, we're in the closing weeks here before the caucuses. Elizabeth Warren is the only woman in the top tier of the race. Amy Klobuchar is still, I think, on the outside looking in on that. And if she is sort of able to turn this discussion, about the role of women in politics and whether or not a woman can become president in her favor, I think, as Emily was alluding to, that could, a lot of voters who are on the fence right now, particularly women voters, could rally to her cause. Now, that's not to say that this doesn't carry a lot of risk. I think it's going to be really difficult for her to try and peel off any Bernie Sanders supporters from all of this, and the backlash there could only cause them to rally around their candidate further. And I think we're going to see how this really plays out on the campaign trail this weekend. Sanders and Warren are going to be in Iowa, and this could potentially be one of their last long stretches in Iowa before the caucuses because of the Senate impeachment trial. They may have to spend a lot of time in D.C. In these next couple weeks before Iowa, but I do think that while this certainly carries a lot of risk, if Warren is able to rally a lot of women to her side, and women are a huge chunk of the Democratic electorate in such a fluid race, I don't think that can be discounted.
Well, so 2 points. One, if Warren or Klobuchar fall short in this nomination, there is just this big picture. There is going to be a reckoning in the Democratic Party about what the female candidates for president went through. And how voters responded to them in many ways, as we discussed, Emily, playing pundit and wondering whether or not a woman could win, not being sexist but worried about sexism. There's going to be a big reckoning. Let's put that aside for a moment. Because, Adam, I know that, look, there is and I agree more so than I would have even thought in the immediate aftermath of the debate that maybe this is the jolt that Warren's campaign needed. However, there is a separate scenario, a separate idea out there that as Warren and Bernie violate this non-aggression pact that they had, these two great friends finally starting to turn on each other, as they inevitably would in a race because, after all, they're opponents, does this benefit Joe Biden?
I think it does. I think ultimately this whole episode and this kind of split among progressives with Warren and Sanders is going to help Joe Biden in the long run. And it's kind of amazing, really, at these past few debates. I mean, Joe Biden, who even though he's not necessarily leading in Iowa and New Hampshire, is still the national frontrunner in this race. And I think a lot of us would consider him still the most likely person to emerge from this nomination fight this summer. And, the last couple of debates, he hasn't taken a lot of fire. And I think if the focus remains on Warren and Sanders and progressives kind of remains split among him and the more moderate portion of the party continue to gravitate to Joe Biden, I think in the long run this could help him, because I also think there's sort of the underlying part of all of this is that I think most Democrats assume that only one of Sanders or Warren are going to kind of get to that final stage of the race when we're down to maybe the final two candidates, right? Like they are the progressives in this race, but really only one of them is going to be able to emerge from that lane. And by the time we get to that point, is this rift between their supporters going to be so severe that it's going to prevent them from rallying around whoever emerges from those two, and that it ultimately helps, whether it's Joe Biden or whoever else emerges from kind of that more moderate establishment lane, once we get, into March or April, this thing.
I mean, one note about Biden in the debates, per the tracking from the Washington Post, he actually spoke the third least in the December debate. And he spoke the second least.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
In this week's debate, the only candidate who participated in both debates, our apologies to Andrew Yang, who spoke less, was Tom Steyer. And this is a guy who, over the course of the last month, as we've discussed many times on the show, really has emerged as a fragile but also clear front runner in this race. And Emily, it was unexpected, I think, because it seemed like Sanders and his campaign spent all week prepping people for attacks on Joe Biden, whether it was his Iraq war record or Social Security. And it just didn't happen. I mean, we got a little foreign policy, but not much.
Well, I think even in the exchange between Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, what you saw was candidates who were being very careful in terms of attacking one another. I mean, they saved their harshest exchange for what they thought was off the microphone and off the cameras. Unfortunately for them, it was caught on the microphone still. But there's certainly a caution, and we wrote about this, amongst all of the candidates not to go after one another. They can let their surrogates and their supporters do the attacking. None of them wants to be seen as being overly aggressive because there's still so much fluidity in the race. And I think, as we talked about in the past, when you have little to lose, like a Tulsi Gabbard or a Julian Castro, and you're just trying to gain some traction, you can be more aggressive and not so worried about the downside. For these guys, there's a lot of downside if it doesn't end up coming off well.
Right, and just look at the track record of these candidates who have levied a tax at the debates. I mean, it really has not worked out for them in the long run. I mean, I think probably the most success anybody has had sort of going directly after one of their rivals was Kamala Harris in that first debate in Miami. But that only helped her for maybe a couple weeks. I think everybody else that's tried these sort of one-on-one attacks maybe saw a short-term bump at best, but in the long run, it really did not end up helping them. So I think these candidates. They're taking lessons from that, and when you're a couple weeks out from voting and things are still so unsettled, and Iowa, also kind of has this reputation of not really rewarding negative campaigning, which I think that gets a little overplayed and kind of plays into this sort of stereotype about Midwestern voters. But at the same time, I do think there is a little bit of truth to that, and especially in just the way the Iowa caucuses work. That if you don't reach the 15% threshold, at certain caucus sites, your supporters have to realign. So if you're attacking one candidate's supporters, or you're attacking one candidate at one part of the race, but then at a different part of the race, you're trying to bring them over to your side. That obviously can create some complications. So I just think the fact that sort of the personal direct attacks have had such little success, I think that's why we haven't really been seeing that at some of these recent debates.
Well, I just got to say, I think, again, this was the last debate before people actually start to make decisions in this primary. And I think, in particular, what I was most interested in seeing ahead of this debate was if Bernie Sanders was able to go after Joe Biden on Social Security, which his campaign telegraphed over and over, that his long record in public service, that he had at different points expressed an openness to cutting Social Security in one way or another. That's a hotly contested debate and argument. I'm sure the Biden folks would contest it. However, that to me seemed like a real possibility for Bernie Sanders to make some headway on Joe Biden. This isn't something that happened 40 years ago, and an issue that doesn't affect a lot of people, particularly in Iowa, like busing. This is something very clear and present in their lives, in Social Security, particularly in an older state. And it was, I think Bernie's moment to try to make a move on Joe Biden. Their constituencies, believe it or not, really do overlap, and there was an opportunity for him. And I just think we could look back on that moment and the fact that there was more of a confrontation between Bernie and Warren as significant in the fact that he wasn't, as his campaign really made clear they wanted to do, to go after Biden. To me, it's potentially a big picture, a very significant event. One last thought before we move on to the next topic, because I just found this interesting. The viewership numbers for the debate, 7.3 million people. Now this is up from the debate in December, but just for context, the first debate in Miami all the way back in June had 18 million viewers. A lot of the general populace still kind of tuning this race out, and it's a little surprising. I would expect that the share of people in Iowa watching was pretty high, but just something to keep in mind. Big picture, if you think everyone's kind of rushing into this race right now and paying attention, it's not.
Right. And I wonder how much of that too just has to do with a lot of the coverage after the debates as well. I think has reflected that not much has changed after these debates. I can't really think of have there really been any moments that have changed the course of the race long term? I don't really think so. And even what are we talking about after this last debate? It's actually something that happened after the debate was over, and something that wasn't actually litigated on the debate stage. So I wonder, as voters are kind of making up their minds here, they don't view debates as something that is as helpful to them as maybe they once did. But it is an interesting dynamic that this right, and the fatigue is sure all of that. But the viewership numbers I think is sort of an underplayed story in all this. But let's maybe talk about some of those undecided voters.
Let's talk about them.
I think it's been really fascinating, and this happens in every election. But I do think it is notable that now that we're a couple weeks from Iowa, and there's so little separation between the top four candidates, and so many caucus goers and voters in a lot of the early states, even those who maybe say they have made up their minds, are still open to switching, and there are still so many undecided voters. And, we've been talking a lot about, some of the ideological splits between the candidates, but I think this race has also fallen just as much along demographic lines. Alex, you alluded to how, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden have actually, had a little bit of a back and forth because they're going after a similar slice of working class voters. But I think one of the, big, remaining groups here, or kind of one of the more volatile groups that could really, tip this race one way or the other are white college-educated voters. And this is something you wrote about, Alex. And just to kind of give our listeners, just kind of a brief kind of explainer on why we sort of dice the electorate like this, because we talk a lot about the ideological lanes. You have the progressives, the moderates, and all that. But then when you're looking at certain demographic groups in the Democratic primary, which of them have make up a significant subset of the electorate. White college-educated voters are certainly that, making up about a quarter of it. And then which, are sort of the swing groups. We talk a lot about black voters, for instance, but they have been pretty consistently with Joe Biden since the beginning. We've talked about working-class voters. They are more or less going with Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders throughout the course of the race. But as you wrote, Alex, college-educated voters have been all over the place throughout this entire race.
Yeah, I mean, like as you say, I mean, a lot of different voter groups have, relatively speaking, been locked into their candidate, whether that's Biden or Sanders, but these college-educated, white, suburban, relatively affluent, maybe MSNBC watching voters,
Rachel Maddow fans,
right? But in some respects, have bounced between the candidates. Whether that was, if you look at the polling as we did in the story, CNN has polled almost every month and broken out, which candidate has the most support among college-educated white voters. At first, it was actually Joe Biden. And as much as we talk about how his support, despite the sort of flurry of attacks against him, hasn't affected, it has affected his support with this demographic group. And they have, at different times, really kind of flocked to someone like Kamala Harris after the first debate. Then they, decided, no, she's not actually for us. Then they went to Elizabeth Warren and really helped power her rise through the fall. And then again, as we mentioned, some of the Medicare for All attacks came, and they were like, I'm not so sure. And now, particularly in the early states like Iowa or New Hampshire, where Buttigieg is most present, they've kind of gone to his campaign. And we've seen this group of voters, and we've seen this group of voters switch to all these different candidates. And the question is, who are they going to settle on? Right, and that's the most important part. That's why they could matter in a place like Iowa, as Emily mentioned earlier. So many voters are uncertain about who they're going to vote for, even if they say, in fact, that they support so and so candidate. They actually indicate they're still open to changing their mind when pollsters ask. So it's a big deal, and I thought it was a group worth analyzing. Obviously, the first question is, why would this group be more open to changing or cycling through candidates than other demographic groups? And the explanation seems to be a lot of these folks, they really dislike Donald Trump, and they're really fixated on trying to defeat him. And they're more inclined to play pundit, as we were just talking about. And so it becomes this kind of second order thought process where it's, who do I like? And in fact, I talked to a voter like this who was almost romanticizing in the past how, I could just vote for the candidate I wanted to. Now I can't. Now now I have to think about, well, who do my Republican neighbors, who would they be open to voting for? And that just naturally, you're going to be less sure about what other people think than what you think.
And you're going to be less, and this is why they've been bouncing around to so many candidates, despite the fact that they're all so different. Like how someone could support, a Pete Buttigieg, who has kind of tried to carve out a little bit more of like a moderate stance in the race, but then obviously Elizabeth Warren, much farther to the left. For them, it's less about what do I think about, Medicare for all or about certain policy issues. But like you said, they're not trying to make up their minds. They're trying to think, okay, who would these voters support? Who would other people support? That's who I'm going to vote for.
Right, and that makes you more. Again, these candidates have risen and fallen seemingly as the narratives around them have changed in a way that hasn't been the case with Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. And I think that's what happens when you're trying to think about who my neighbor will vote for. You're going to be a lot more sensitive to that conversation. And when the conversation turns negative, as it inevitably does in some case, maybe you're going to start to look for a different candidate. Now, look, the bottom line is, okay, so who are these voters going to support en masse? And I think this dovetails, Emily, with our first conversation, that Warren, in some ways, making a pitch about her electability, again, voters who really care about, defeating Donald Trump. And I should say, not just care about defeating Donald Trump, but are like maybe especially tuned into this race. They've made it kind of a part of their daily lives, whether to tune into MSNBC, or check Twitter or whatever it is, that her making an electability push, maybe she brings some back on board in this race. Or look, maybe Pete Buttigieg, they ultimately decide that a candidate who reminds them most of Barack Obama, at least in rhetoric, maybe he's the candidate. And so, it's an interesting discussion. And I know a lot of the Democrats and pollsters I spoke with they really didn't have any ideas about where these voters end up. One interesting thing to think about, just because it's always interesting to kind of dive into the electorates of both parties and what their priorities are. One thing that did come out is that for as much as they dislike Trump, and as one pollster described it to me, their dislike or their hatred of President Trump is sky high right now. They still see compromise as a fundamental part of what they want in a candidate, and they still prioritize that above, say, like the kind of class war that Bernie Sanders is fighting or wants to fight. And that would explain, again, why, they're maybe a little bit turned off when they started to think that, Elizabeth Warren is too liberal, and no, we need a candidate. It's why they might flock to someone like Pete Buttigieg, who talks like that, in his own campaign speeches. So,
And it just provides a really, I think, interesting. This particular voter group provides a really interesting window into this whole, vague and subjective concept of electability that has been driving so much of the conversation in the 2020 election. Voters say they want somebody who can beat Donald Trump, and we don't know exactly who that could be. I mean, it could be any one of these candidates, but the fact that they're bouncing around to so many, they're even in their own minds, they can't even figure out exactly what electability is. Is it we need someone who's a woman? We need a person of color. We just need sort of a safe, moderate white guy. And of course, I think this whole the whole electability argument does ultimately, or just sort of inherently hurts, people who aren't white men, right? Because you think of who can be elected president. Well, it's been mostly white men, so it can be a little bit tougher maybe for voters to envision an Elizabeth Warren or an Amy Klobuchar winning. But I do think now that Elizabeth Warren in particular has made this a part of her pitch. If she can get these voters to her side, I mean, as I mentioned, they make up a quarter of the electorate, but they play an even more outsized role in states like Iowa and New Hampshire, and will play a huge role down the road as well in Super Tuesday states. And then you also have to consider that's when Michael Bloomberg comes into the race. And I think Alex, you actually in one of the voters you quoted in your story, who has bounced around to several different candidates, is now looking at and Michael Bloomberg. So he continues to hang over this whole race in more ways than one as well.
Well, speaking of candidates who are not white men, Cory Booker. The week actually began with news that he was ending his campaign for president. The announcement was part surprise, part expected. The senator's campaign has struggled badly to gain even the barest of traction either nationally or in any of the early states. But the decision also brought to an end one of the primary's enduring mysteries, because even if Booker didn't break through, most Democrats and political reporters struggle to understand why he wasn't more of a success. He was young, dynamic, progressive, and could make a pretty strong argument that he was one of the field's most electable candidates. So, Emily, it's one of the biggest mysteries of the primary. Like I said, solve it for us right now. Here we go.
Yeah, there's a couple things with Booker. I think the way he approached his campaign, it was in some ways, it was unique, and it helped him stand out, this radical love and unity message. But in other ways, I just think it wasn't the moment for that. Yes, people are fed up with Trump and the divisiveness, but I think what they want to see is someone who can really, again, as we've just been talking about, defeat Trump, and that might take a pretty hard edge. Nobody thinks this is going to be a nice, cuddly general election where everyone is, really friendly with one another, even though they're political opponents. So,
you don't think the Democratic nominee and Trump could just stick to the issues?
Right, exactly.
You don't think that's going to happen?
Yeah, that's probably unlikely. So, I think there was a bit of a disconnect where people were like, oh, I really like Cory Booker. He seems like a really good guy. He's well-spoken. He's smart. He has experience. But they're like, I mean, I don't see how that message really works when Trump is just going to go down into the nastiest parts of the political discourse. So that's my own inclination, and I don't know that other people necessarily share that, but that's sort of my impression. I think another thing is when you do have this sort of ideological divide, the way we've seen in the primary with Bernie and Elizabeth Warren staking out some pretty far left policy items like Medicare for all, and then you have others like Biden who are really clearly more to the establishment side of the Democratic Party. There wasn't a clear place where Cory Booker fell. I mean, he had some very ambitious policy proposals, but that wasn't really part of the identity that he projected or that he spent a lot of time, it seemed like, talking about on the campaign trail. He talked more about kind of these bigger, higher level aspirations. And it just seemed like the race from the start just never really fit what Cory Booker was trying to do.
Go ahead.
And I was going to say, and that's something, what Emily, was talking about. That's something that, we identified from the very beginning of this race. I mean, those were all,
not to brag about ourselves.
No, I mean, just, all the early stories that we wrote about Cory Booker were, does this message of love and unity really resonate in the year 2019 or in the year 2020? Clearly, the answer was no. I think a couple of other things that sort of hurt him from the start. One, a similar dynamic that Kamala Harris and Kristen Gillibrand faced, trying to find that sort of in-between lane between, the Joe Bidens of the world and the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warrens of the world, much like Kamala Harris and Kristen Gillibrand, initially raced to the left, supporting things like Medicare for all, and he had some other very far-reaching progressive ideas at the beginning of his campaign. I know that's something that you've talked a lot about, Alex.
He wanted to set up a trust fund for every American child, basically a baby bond. Pretty radical stuff.
$50 minimum wage, all of that, but that really was never, a core part of his campaign message, throughout, much of the past year. So I think just from an ideological standpoint, never really found his place in the party. But I think the number one overarching, kind of dynamic that really hurt Cory Booker was that his quote unquote star power, I think, peaked a couple years ago. You think about when he was the mayor of Newark, sort of billed as this rising star within the Democratic Party.
He would tweet out how he was shoveling snow in front of a constituent's driveway,
became,
whatever it was. Yeah.
And, rose up to be New Jersey senator in 2013. Spoke at the Democratic convention, has been, a go-to surrogate for Democratic candidates for years. I think by the time his campaign launched, at least among, and I think this, falls a lot on the shoulders of the political press as well. He wasn't, the shiny new object at that point. Like, we already kind of knew who Cory Booker was. We knew what he was all about, even though voters maybe didn't. So his campaign wasn't really covered as sort of a new thing, in maybe the same way that Pete Buttigieg's was, for instance. So I think that when it's almost peaking too early. In a football
timing
season,
is everything.
The timing is everything, and I just think that and because of that, he was just never able to have even a moment in this race. I just wanted to run some of these polling numbers by you guys. I think it's really fascinating.
You have data? You did homework on this thing?
So for I was always kind of I never really viewed Cory Booker as a top tier candidate at any point during this race. I thought he had the potential to get there. I thought he'd at least have a moment at some point. I mean, he had by all accounts, had a very strong campaign staff, had a lot of endorsements on the ground in states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Again, by all accounts, had a very strong organization there. But looking back at the Real Clear Politics polling average, never was above 7% throughout all of 2019 or 2020, and that was back in March of last year. He closed out the race at a Real Clear Politics average of just 3 points. That's where he generally was in most of the polls the last few months. But as Emily mentioned, I mean, he was very well liked among the Democratic electorate. Monmouth's Iowa poll that just came out a couple weeks ago had him at a plus 42 favorable rating. That puts him right up there with a lot of the top candidates in the race, even better than Joe Biden. Yet he was at just 4% overall, and just as critically, only a 3% of Iowa caucus goers viewed him as their second choice. So he never really got out of the friend zone, right? Everyone liked him a lot. They're glad that he was running for president, but they just never viewed him as not only their first choice, but not their second or their third choice either.
That was the Philadelphia Inquirer, just to give credit to them. They had a headline that was about the Cory Booker being in the friend zone. I would just point out one last thing with Booker, that despite having some of those, as you said, like ultra progressive positions, he did have this past as a New Jersey senator where he was, working on behalf of major constituent groups who happen to be big financial corporations, because that's a big part of New Jersey. And so I think it was going to be very difficult for him to bridge that gap to win over people like on the far left who might be Warren or Bernie supporters, even though he's proposing some of these progressive policy ideas. It's just because of his links to the financial sector and the fact that he was sort of this establishment political figure, did the traditional fundraising circuit, rose up kind of through the traditional circles.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember. If he ever would have gotten into the point in the race where he was viewed as a top tier contender, there was a lot of stuff to dig in to his record, everything you mentioned, plus his past support for charter schools that I think would have hurt him with a lot of progressives.
Yeah, it was quietly one of the more telling moments for how the primary was going to go. It was only really like a couple of months after Booker declared in the winter of last year, almost a full year ago at this point. He actually gave a speech, I believe it was back in Newark, where he talked about basically not letting perfect be the enemy of good, and that we have to deliver real, tangible progress now to the voters who need it the most. And it was the sign of he was already recalibrating, and really to his and his team's credit, did it a lot sooner than other candidates, that, you know what, actually running as an ultra-lefty or as the progressive candidate is not going to work in this race. They tried to recalibrate. It didn't take on, but look, it really is in a race with 25 candidates running for president. No, duh. It's really hard to win the nomination, and we have seen candidate after candidate after candidate. I feel like we spent half of this show, in fact, talking about candidates who trying to navigate the changing Democratic electorate and single payer health care, and they gave it an effort. They obviously didn't succeed.
And this also, we should mention, won't be the last we're hearing of Cory Booker. I mean, whoever the Democratic nominee is, he'll be on the VP shortlist, and likely will be a go-to surrogate.
Okay, we are now going to begin what is my favorite segment every week. Tell me something I don't know. Emily, you're up first.
So I thought there were some really interesting numbers in this new Nevada poll that came out from the Reno newspaper earlier this week. I mean, Nevada's an early state. It comes after New Hampshire, and yet it still gets overlooked. People kind of skip right over Nevada and go to South Carolina, and it's harder to poll because it's a caucus state as well, and it can be unpredictable in that sense. But not only was Biden has sort of been in the lead, just I think in large part due to his name ID. In this particular poll, his lead had shrunk to 1 point, with Bernie Sanders surging up, and both Buttigieg and Tom Steyer both rose 5 percentage points to 8%. So there's a lot. I think we're looking at Iowa and New Hampshire right now as sort of these big make or break states, but there's still a lot of churn going on in Nevada too, which could be an interesting kind of factor leading into South Carolina, where things seem a lot more clear-cut with Biden sort of having this durable lead there.
I get the sense we're going to be talking a lot more about Sanders and Latino voters.
Yeah.
Just a hunch, and it's not really clear to me how much support he has, but there's at least a possibility. It's more than we know right now. Adam, you're up next.
Well, I want to briefly fast forward to the general election, and I think as our listeners know, I am contractually obligated to mention Wisconsin at least once on every episode of this podcast.
Yeah. $20 a mention? Do I have that right?
Well, I don't like to talk finances, Alex. It's a private agreement, and I'll just leave it at that. But just this week, we got a new poll from the Gold Standard poll in Wisconsin, the Marquette University Law School poll. Now that we're into 2020, we're getting one of these about every month. So just kind of a good check-in to where things stand in Wisconsin, a key battleground state, maybe the key battleground state when this is all said and done. And I've noticed in these last few polls, there's been an interesting gap between President Trump's overall job approval rating and the approval of his handling of the economy. So just on job approval, Wisconsin voters 48% approve, 49% disapprove. Actually, pretty good for him. It's been steadily rising in Wisconsin, and is certainly a couple points ahead of his national average right now. But then you take a look at his handling of the economy, it's up to 55% approve, 42% disapprove. So you're looking at a really, I think, critical group of, about 7% of that Wisconsin electorate that doesn't approve of Trump's job performance, meaning that, they probably, aren't a big fan of his just overall conduct in office, the way he carries himself, his rhetoric, his Twitter feed, maybe even, other certain policies that he's pursued. But on the economy, they look at, the unemployment rate is down, the stock market's doing well. They generally feel like they are in a good place financially, so they approve of his handling of the economy. So, that group, I think, is going to be receiving a lot of attention between now and November, both from Trump and the Republicans. How do you convince these people that maybe generally don't like Trump, but approve of the way the economy is going, that you want to stick with him for another 4 years? And for the Democrats, how do you convince these people that things could be better, basically, under a Democratic president? I think that's going to be a really key group to watch over the next several months.
Incidentally, if you are one of those people or know one of those people, let me know. Email me at
McClatchyDC.com. Not that I'm recycling content here, but I did tweet this out the other day when the poll was released, and someone actually responded to me saying, I am one of these voters, and made the point very clearly that Democrats need to articulate a very specific message, and that you can't just expect these people to vote for vote against Trump, right? Democrats need to give these people something to vote for.
Yeah, I could see them being the subject of a couple 3,000-word profiles. just throwing that out there. Okay, mine is pretty simple and straightforward. I know we focus a lot on the presidential primary. I do want to point out though the coming congressional races, and in talking with a lot of people, already plotting how they're going to win different House and Senate races from both parties. To be clear, there is only one and only one question that they're asking themselves right now: is Bernie Sanders going to win the nomination? If he doesn't, it's going to be a pretty standard congressional race. You're going to have, of course, it will be dictated by the top, but someone like Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg or possibly even Elizabeth Warren, their agenda, what they want to accomplish in office, can roughly match what you see from your average Senate candidate, say Cal Cunningham in North Carolina or Mark Kelly in Arizona. All of that changes, of course, if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, and you would have almost an unprecedented situation in American politics where the agenda and aims of someone at the top of the ticket for either national party is at times wildly different than what you see down the ticket. If you think we've talked a lot about Medicare for all during the primary, just wait till the general election. And I know it is something that Republicans and Democrats who are already underway working on these races are really wondering hard about. So just something to keep in mind. It's not all about the presidential race, folks. We are going to be talking about Senate and House races.
I think that's like one of the more like interesting sort of like under the radar dynamics of all this right now. And I think one thing to keep an eye on the next few weeks, Joe Biden starting to collect, every day it feels like he's getting a couple more endorsements from those more moderate swing district Democrats in the House. If there's, really a kind of a wave of these to Joe Biden, that'll tell you that they're really concerned about the prospect of having, a more progressive nominee at the top of the ticket.
Okay, that's it for the show. I want to thank, of course, Adam and Emily. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you to our producer, Jeremy Sheeler, and to our executive producer, Davin Coburn. And thank you, our listeners. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you use. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating or a review. Talk to you next week.